Hi everyone, let's get started with our introduction to the course. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to be talking about some just general overview of what we call an overview of genetics. There's no particular chapter in our online book that covers this information. This is sort of just my own way to kind of give you a glimpse of what we're going to be discussing in class this semester. Some of the topics we'll be hitting on, and then also to introduce some important vocabulary that you're going to see throughout the coming weeks. So let's go ahead and get started with I give you a little outline here. We're going to be talking about different levels of where we can study genetics. We'll talk a little bit more about important things like DNA, genes, alleles, and chromosomes. We'll also discuss the interaction between genes and our environment, and then I'll have a little review at the end. So, what is genetics? Genetics is considered the study of inherited traits and their variation. So when you're thinking about traits, it's most common to think about physical traits that we can all see. So think of eye color and hair color and skin color and things like having freckles or not having freckles, maybe having a, a dimpled chin or not having a dimpled chin. There's a whole host of different things that we could sort of cover when it comes to physical traits. But those are sort of just the ones that are most obvious to us. But keep in mind that our genetics is more than just what we can physically see. So these traits also include incredibly important things like how our cells are functioning, how our tissues are working, how our organ systems are coordinating with each other. All of those are also genetically controlled. It's just that we typically don't think of those the same way that we think of those visible traits that we can see. Genetics is a life science. It is not the same thing as genealogy. So for those of you who watched my lecture video, I mentioned this idea that you might be somewhat familiar with the concept of DNA genetics if you have subscribed to one of those websites where they do your ancestry for you, right? So they ask for a DNA sample, they analyze that sample, and then they give you a glimpse into your past, into your ancestry. That's genealogy. So tracing your ancestry is referred to as this concept of genealogy. Genetics is different. We're not studying sort of where you came from. Instead, in genetics, we're studying who you are and what your genes tell us about you. It's an informational science, and it's having a huge impact on society, and we'll talk some more about those things in a minute. So your genetics is a study or a glimpse of your genes. So what's a gene? A gene is all of the information that we need on how to make proteins. Proteins are the jack of all trades. We'll talk more about those in coming weeks. They're the jack of all trades. They do a whole host of different things. But your genes tell us how to make a protein, and then a protein does something for us within our cells. Your genes themselves are composed of DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So your DNA is probably, again, it's a term you've somewhat maybe familiar with. You've heard it before in maybe your freshman biology course, or maybe again, depending on the shows that you watch on TV, they talk about DNA evidence that links a suspect to a crime scene. So your DNA is all of the set of information on how to build and maintain you as an organism. And all living things contain DNA. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're a bacterium or if you're a mouse or if you are a tree or if you're a human, your DNA inside of your cells tells us how to make you, whatever you happen to be. Your traits, the physical manifestation of those proteins that we're making in those genes, is an interaction in some cases, in many cases, between your genes and the environment. So there are some genes for which your traits are what they are. There's no influence of the environment whatsoever. Those are referred to as simple Mendelian traits, and we'll talk about those this semester as well. But for the most part, everything else, there's an interaction. You don't live in a bubble. You interact with your environment on a daily basis, and your environment has an impact on how your genes are expressing those proteins and what those traits actually look like. If we wanted to talk about the complete set of genetic information for any living thing, we would refer to it as a genome. So a genome, again, refers to all of the genes that we have in any given organism. It includes both the genes, the sequences that code for a protein, and it also includes all of the DNA that does not. I'm going to tell you, most of the DNA that is found in your body doesn't code for a gene. It doesn't make a protein. That doesn't mean it's useless. It just means that in some cases it either modifies or tells us how a gene is going to be used, or in other cases we just don't know what it does. It's there, but we're not entirely sure what those sequences are for. We have a lot of that DNA. We used to call it junk DNA because we didn't think it was worth anything. We know we're wrong now. We've changed our mind. That's the great thing about science. Science learns new things. We adapt to that knowledge, and we change what we know. And so we know that not all of that DNA that's non-coding is useless. There's plenty of value there. We're just still trying to unravel and uncover what that value happens to be. And then genomics is a field that analyzes and compares the genomes of different species. So we can compare our genome to a chimpanzee genome. We can compare that genome to a capuchin monkey genome. We can compare across all these different types of animals to gauge how much we have in common. So if we're talking about levels of genetics, we can talk about genetic information being transmitted at several different levels. So the base level, right, are things like DNA and genes and chromosomes. Those are different levels of genetic information. So again, DNA is like a set of blueprints for a cell. It contains all of the necessary information on how to build and maintain that living organism, whatever that organism happens to be. So looking at these levels of genetics, again, this is a generalist cell. So this is a drawing of your cell. You'll see this again next week. Inside this cell, there is a structure called the nucleus. Inside the nucleus is where we have all of our genetic information. Your genetic information is in pieces, long pieces referred to as chromosomes, and every living thing has a particular number of chromosomes. If you were to take those chromosomes and unwrap them and unwind them, they're made up of these little proteins called histones, and then the DNA itself. So here's the DNA. It's a double helix. One segment of that DNA is a gene. Okay, and then within the genes, we have these base pairs of encoding information, right? And again, you'll learn all about this as the weeks continue on. But our DNA consists of this double helix, which contains a nucleotide, and they're made up of phosphates, sugars, and bases. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this right now because in a few weeks we're going to have a lecture on DNA and you're going to learn more about this. But your DNA is really a sequence of letters. It spells very unique words that only other cells know how to read. And it's only made up of 4 letters, 5 letters if you include the molecule RNA, G, A, and T, and C. And so we know how to read the code that is encoded in here. Our bodies can read it and interpret it and turn it into a product. So again, genes are sequences that tell our cells to make a protein. Those proteins then are responsible for our traits. I've already talked about coding and non-coding regions of your DNA. So some places are telling us what the gene does, and some places tell us when it's active or when it's not active. So we can turn genes on and off. What's really interesting, what I always found fascinating, is there's not a direct correlation between the complexity of an organism and how many genes it has, right? Because we'd probably consider humans to be the most complex organism, right? So we are capable of so many things that other living things are not capable of. So you would think that we would have a large number of genes that would be responsible for all of the traits that make us who we are. But in reality, that's not actually the case. Let's make some comparisons here. So here we have some E. coli bacteria, very simple living things. They have about 4,400 genes just for these little tiny bacteria. That's an awful lot of genes. A fruit fly, very simple insect here, short lifespan, doesn't do much beyond reproducing and eating. That's about all a fruit fly does. It has 13,700 genes. Humans actually come in next. We have a little more than 23,000 genes. We're not nearly as complex as you would think. A house mouse has more genes than we do. They have almost 30,000 genes. And topping the scale here is a rice plant. A rice plant has 50,000 genes. So again, don't make the mistake of thinking that only complex organisms have a lot of genes. That's not the case. We're pretty compact as far as our genome goes, especially when you compare us to other living things, which again is sort of a conundrum in science as well. How can we be as advanced as we are and have so few genes? We don't know. A few other vocabulary terms just for you here, and I'm going to go through these quickly because, again, we're going to focus on this later. Genes themselves come in different forms. We refer to them as alleles, and it's just a variation of the same trait. So having freckles and not having freckles. So the gene for freckles has two different versions. A copy that has it and a copy that doesn't, and those are referred to as alleles. Same thing with blood type. Depending if you know what your blood type is, there is a genes for blood type. You can have an A, what's referred to as copy of it, an A allele. You have type A blood. A B allele, that's type B blood. O means you have neither A or B, or you can have both. So for each trait, humans have two alleles. You get one from each of your parents, one from mom and one from dad. And the combination of how they interact with each other tells us what trait you're actually going to have. So your genotype is the combination of alleles that you have, and your phenotype is the actual observable expression of those alleles. Do you have freckles? Do you have type A blood or type B blood? Those are phenotypes. So I already talked about chromosomes. Chromosome is basically a large piece of DNA. Again, different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. You inherit one chromosome of a pair from each of your parents. So you get half your chromosomes from mom and half your chromosomes from dad. You have 23 pairs. So one of each of those comes from each parent. 22 of those are referred to as autosomes. They're the same in all of us. And then you have one pair of sex chromosomes, and those are the X and the Y chromosomes. We have lots of cells, anywhere from 50 to 100 trillion cells, depends on your age, depends on your size, depends on lots of different things. Every single cell, except for red blood cells, have the exact same copy of DNA in them, every single one. Now, does that mean every cell in your body produces every protein that you need? No. You don't need the genes to be on for freckles in your heart. You have the genes for freckles in your heart, but your heart doesn't care. They're not useful to your heart. So the cells in your heart aren't producing proteins to make freckles. The only cells that are producing proteins to make freckles are in your skin. So even though we have all of these different cells, this DNA in all of our cells, it doesn't necessarily mean that we produce all the proteins at the same time. So there's something called differentiation. It tells a heart cell to be a heart cell and only produce the proteins that a heart needs. We have liver cells that tell our liver only to produce the proteins that the liver needs. So it's a process called differentiation. And if we're looking at the whole human organism, if we break it down into the organ systems, like the digestive system, for example, we can break that down into individual organs, which are made up of tissues composed of individual cells, which are composed of organelles, and I apologize, my figure got kind of cut off here, and then molecules inside. But essentially, it's the set of genes that are turned on at the right time, at the right moment, that makes all of the organs in your body work as part of this larger organ system so that you can function as an organism. We already talked about genotypes and phenotypes. I'm not going to talk about dominant and recessive things right now. You'll refer to those a little bit later. Again, I don't want to make this intro lecture too long. I already talked about this concept that there are Mendelian traits, which are traits that are expressed through just the action of a single gene. Nothing else is responsible. Your blood type, whether you have freckles, your hair, whether you have a cleft chin, all of those have no interaction of the environment. There are then traits which are determined by multiple genes, no impact of the environment, but multiple genes. So things like eye color is a good one. Height I have on here, but technically that's a multifactorial trait. What's a multifactorial trait? Things that are both genetic and environment. So your hair color. Your hair color might be a darker shade in the winter, and then light hits it and it turns a lighter color. That's an influence between the environment and your genes. Inherited illnesses are a really good example of multifactorial traits. Your diabetes, cardiovascular disease, your risk of cancer, all of those, you may have genes that predispose you to those conditions, but your environment also plays a key role in determining on whether you'll actually inherit those or not. So again, you can think of a trait like polydactyly, the extra digits for fingers and toes. That's a purely genetic trait. You either have it or you don't. Versus traits such as skin color, right? There are genes for skin color, but for fair skinned people who don't have very much melanin or pigment in their skin, if they spend a lot of time outside, their skin will change color, right? They'll get darker during the summer as their body produces more melanin to protect them from the sun. You are connected to your family through your genetics, right? So this is how we can trace those traits, right? You inherited your dad's ears or your mom's nose or your grandpa's teeth or whatever it happens to be, right? It's often fun that we look at our family and try to figure out who we look like and who we resemble. So again, knowing that each generation of individuals is genetically connected to the generation above them through your DNA, we can use a diagram called a pedigree to actually study traits. And we'll talk about pedigrees a little bit later on in the semester. Even beyond that, we can take a group of people who live in the same place at the same time. It's referred to as a population. And we can talk about all the genes in the population. So the population of Palatine, Illinois, or the population of the state of Illinois, or the entire United States, or North America. Our population can be as big or small as we want to consider it. And what we look at then is we look at patterns of what we call allele frequencies. So how often are there genes for freckles popping up in the population? Are there more and more people with freckles? Are there less and less people with freckles? Is it the same number of people with freckles generation after generation? Those little tiny changes in the frequency of a particular trait is actually what we refer to as evolution. So changing allele frequencies over time in populations is a sign that a population is evolving. So what is evolution? Really what it is it is the tracing of these genetic frequencies of genes and how well adapted any group of living things is to their environment at that moment. That's what it's really all about. So to have the best chance at survival generation after generation, we have to have the combination of traits that makes us successful. Successful means surviving and reproducing. It doesn't matter if you're a bacteria or a mushroom or a fly or anything else. That's what being successful in life is. And over generations, if we see new traits that enable a population to be more successful and survive longer, that means that population is evolving. But what's also really interesting when it comes to studying genomics in particular is comparing what we're calling evolutionary relationships. How closely related are we to other living things? How much of our DNA is ours and is unique to humans? And how much is shared by everything else? And what's really fascinating is that if you took our genome and compare it with the genome of a chimpanzee, 98% of the DNA sequences are the same. And when I say DNA sequences, I mean, remember those letters I was talking about, those A's, C's, T's, and G's? The way that they're laid out, the order that they're written in is identical, 98%. So that says we have a lot in common with our closest living relative. We share genes with lots of things. It's not just chimpanzees. There are genes that are identical in humans and mice, humans and fish, fruit flies, yeast, even bacteria. We have some of the same cells. There's an awful lot of relationship between these living things. So this is kind of a nice diagram that talks about sort of the branches of our living tree, if you will. So As we go along, as different things sort of moved off of our evolutionary tree and evolved traits on their own, and you can see sort of chimpanzees and us had a more recent split than us and mice or us and fish. You can look at this diagram and say, how much do we have in common with these things? I have more in common with a chimpanzee than I do with a mouse, but I have more in common with a mouse than I do with a fish. And I have more in common with that fish than I happen to have with that yeast, right? The idea here is looking at shared genetic sequences. So, good information, what do we do with it? Okay, we learn about our evolutionary history, but what else do we do? There's lots of ways that genetics are impacting our lives. I've talked about DNA profiling already a few times. We can establish all kinds of things by knowing this. We can establish our ancestry. We can establish parental relationships. We can also look at identity cases here, ruling out who is and has not left information, for example, at the scene of a crime. Is your DNA there? Well, if your DNA is there, then you were there. Doesn't mean you committed the crime, but it means that we can say that you were there at one point or another. There's a kind of an interesting story about applications of genetics, the history and ancestry. And I'm actually going to kind of fly through this. You can read all about it, some really interesting stories here. But again, I don't want to run this video too long. We are also using this in information about healthcare currently. So now if you are susceptible to different types of diseases, specifically certain types of cancers, they can do genomic testing to figure out if you have variations of genes that make you more susceptible to breast cancer, for example. And that's starting to permeate across other places in healthcare as well. It's not just cancer genes now. We can talk about your cardiovascular health and your risks for your cardiovascular health based on your genetics. So there's all kinds of things that we can do. So that sort of finishes things off for this first lecture. These are the terms that I discussed. Here's some important concepts. This is a really good place to start when it comes for looking at when you're ready to start studying for an exam. I highly recommend looking at these lecture review slides and going back and previewing all of this material.